Hi, today we are going to start talking about eukaryotic cell structure. Eukaryotic cells are your protists, your fungi, your plant, and your animal cells. And I'll show you later on what a protist and fungi cell look like. A fungi would be like your mushrooms and that type of thing. Protists are kind of funky. They're like your algae, single cellular organisms. But we're going to focus mostly today on plant and cell animals. And if you look at this very first slide, you'll see that I've given you a picture of a plant cell and an animal cell. And the main difference that I want you to notice in these two pictures is that the plant cell has a cell wall outside of the cell membrane. It also has chloroplasts, and it has a very large vacuole. And so these are organelles that you'll see in the plant cell that you will not see in the animal cell. And the next two slides will give you kind of a breakdown, a closer look at those. Before we start talking about the different organelles in the cell, I should tell you what an organelle is. The best way for me to relate to what an organelle is to think about our bodies. And just like our bodies have organs that work together to help our bodies survive and function, cells have organelles that work together to help them survive and function. There are multiple jobs that the cells in your body have, the cells in all organisms have. And we're going to look at 4 of them throughout the year, but today we're specifically going to look at protein synthesis, which is the last one on the list here. But just so you know, I would say the primary jobs that a cell performs would be cellular respiration. Respiration is like breathing, essentially. So that's when they convert the oxygen that you breathe in to carbon dioxide that you breathe out through a number of steps, but that's the simplified explanation of cellular respiration. Photosynthesis would be when the plant cells convert that chemical energy that they get from the sun into a usable form of energy for the plants to provide food for them. Cellular reproduction would be that idea of mitosis and meiosis, which you may have learned about in a previous biology class, but it's how cells reproduce to create more cells. And then protein synthesis, which is a big part of what cells do, which is producing proteins for your body to use, both inside the cell and outside of the cell. So today when we talk about the different organelles, we're going to really look at how they work together for protein synthesis. In order to make it a little bit easier to understand how these organelles work together, I've classified the organelles into 4 different categories. One would be the organelles that help with the boundary of the cell. Another category is the organelles that help control the cell, and that includes the nucleus. And then the organelles that are responsible for assembly, transport, and storage, mainly related to the proteins that the cell's producing. And then organelles that help provide support for the cell and help the cell with locomotion, which is movement. The first category of cell organelles that I want to go over with you are the organelles that help form the boundary of the cell. And we just spent a lot of time talking about cell membrane in the last unit, which is also the plasma membrane. So I'm not going to say much about that other than saying that as a reminder that it provides protection and support for the cell. And when you look at the picture of the plant cell on the right-hand side versus the animal cell on the left-hand side, you'll see that the outside part of the cell is the cell membrane on the animal cell, but the plant cell has the cell membrane surrounded by a cell wall on the outside. And the cell wall is an organelle that is only in plant cells, it's not in animal cells. And it gives that it's a rigid wall outside the cell membrane that gives extra support to the cells. Most animals and organisms have a skeletal sort of structure that helps give us our support, like our bones and that type of thing. Plants don't have that. So instead of having a skeletal structure, they actually have a cell wall, which gives them that rigidness. You know, when you think of a plant and the stems and the leaves, they're rigid, they're hard, and that's not because of a skeleton, it's because of the cell wall that plants have. So here's where it starts to get a little bit more complicated related to the organelles that you're learning about and how they help the cell produce the proteins that the cell needs. So when it comes to the nucleus and cell control, the four organelles I want to talk to you about are the nucleus itself, the chromosomes that are contained within the nucleus, the ribosomes that are actually outside of the nucleus, and then the cytoplasm, which is kind of that thick fluid that helps hold the organelles in place, gives them a spot to be. So when you think about protein synthesis, cells need to produce proteins. There's various proteins that they need to produce, and basically they get a command from an outside signal that tells them what protein they need to make. It's the job of the nucleus to then take that signal and tell the cell what to do. So the nucleus receives the signal and is basically told you need to make whatever specific type of protein. And just like when you're cooking a dinner or making a recipe or assembling a product, before you can put the product together, the protein in this instance, or a recipe, let's say, you need instructions, you need directions on how to do it. You need to get all the parts gathered up, and then finally you have to kind of put them together, package them up, and get them out to where they're supposed to go. And that's what a cell has to do when it's making a protein. So the nucleus gets the instruction. It's kind of the head person in charge, the head organelle in charge in this case. So that's why the definition for nucleus is to direct activity of cell organelle. So the nucleus knows what it's supposed to make. The first thing it needs to do is to find the directions, the instructions, or the recipe in order to make the product, the protein. And all that information will be contained in the chromosomes of the organism. So the definition for chromosomes is to contain the genetic information that is passed to offspring. And this is located inside the nucleus. But the chromosome essentially contains the recipe for what's supposed to be made. Once the nucleus gets that recipe off the chromosome, it gives that to the ribosome, and the ribosome's job is to then go get all the pieces that it needs to put that protein together and get it to the next organelle we'll talk about in order to assemble the protein. So for the ribosomes, I want the definition that you put on your sheet to be where proteins are assembled according to the DNA directions. So it gets directions from the nucleus, which got the info from the DNA. It goes and grabs all the parts, and then it starts to gets it to the next organelle to assemble those parts. And then the cytoplasm is just going to be that thick fluid that's outside the cell. It shows it nicely on the picture of the animal cell, the blue kind of fluid on the inside that gives the organelles a spot to hang out. So the next step after the ribosomes get all the parts that are needed to create the protein, those parts go to the endoplasmic reticulum, and that's where the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum work together to assemble the proteins. And we're going to study protein synthesis a little more in depth, so you'll get a more hands-on sense of how this works. But for right now, just know that the endoplasmic reticulum is where all those parts come together and the proteins are assembled. There are within the organelle, or within the cell, there is a rough endoplasmic reticulum and a smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The difference being that the rough one actually has ribosomes attached to it on the outside. And again, we'll see this a little bit better with one of the lessons we're going to do soon here. And those ribosomes help to put the protein together. Then you have the Golgi apparatus, which you'll sometimes hear called the Golgi body, so you may hear it either way. And once that protein is assembled, the job of the Golgi apparatus is to basically package it and get it to where it's supposed to go. So imagine that the cell is making multiple proteins at any one time. And so when you've got a whole bunch of proteins floating around, not floating around, but a whole bunch of proteins being made, the Golgi apparatus will then, sort the proteins out, package them, and then kind of basically like label them and ship them to where they're supposed to go. So some of them may stay within the cell, some of them may leave the cell, but it's the Golgi apparatus's job to figure that out. Then you're going to have the vacuoles and the lysosomes, and those are really going to be for storage. In the plant cell, it's got one large vacuole. Animal cells will have multiple vacuoles that are smaller, and that's going to be the sac-like structure used for storage of water, food, and enzymes in the cell. And we'll talk about enzymes further again as we're looking at protein synthesis, but basically you should know that an enzyme's job is to break things down, and it can and you'll see that with the lysosomes. It removes waste using digestive enzymes. So lysosomes are basically the organelle that gets rid of the garbage in the cell. Your mitochondria are very important within your cell, and those are the organelles that produce energy in the cell. So they're going to take that energy that you get from the food you eat and turn it into usable energy for your cells to keep functioning and doing the work that they need to do. And then chloroplasts are only going to be in plant cells, and the chloroplasts take the energy from the sun and they convert it into usable energy for the plant. So the very last set of organelles that I want to talk to you about are the organelles that help with support for the cell and locomotion. Locomotion is movement. The first one I want to talk to you about is the cytoskeleton, and that's basically a network of filaments that help the cells keep their shape. So it's kind of like what a cytoskeleton. It's kind of what a skeleton does for us. Helps the cell hold its shape. The next one I want you to know about are the centrioles, and those are going to help with cell division, which is one of the jobs that we talked about that a cell has, which is reproduction. And again, when we do a unit on mitosis and meiosis, you'll learn more about how the centrioles play into the cell division process. Cilia are little tiny like hair projections that help the cell move, so short hair-like projections that wave to help cells move. Usually if a cell has cilia, it will have multiple cilia around the edge of it. And then there are flagella, which is a long whip-like projection that aids in the movement of cells. Typically it's just going to be one long whip that's on this flagella. And so that's it for organelles. Make sure you fill out your graphic organizer with all the definitions for the organelles. And I know it may be a little bit overwhelming at first because it's a lot of information, but know that we're going to do a couple of activities now that will help you see how all these organelles work in the cell, what they look like, and how they help the cell make proteins.